This is the Fundamental Escape Podcast with your host, Mark Fitzgerald. I'm David Werba, and this is episode 3. Mark, you interviewed Gus Row, who's a former preacher and the author of the books Fast Food Religion and the Dehydrated Gospel. I have to say, I really enjoyed the conversation. He makes a few points that I've thought about many times in my life. Now, first of all, he's a very honest and straightforward man. He's in his 60s.
Yeah.
And he's obviously reached a place of peace and truth in his life, which in and of itself is not unique, but the age at which people reach their truth is different for everybody. Some people can reach their truth at 10 years old. Some people reach it at 50 years old. Some people reach their truth on their deathbed, and some people never do at all. And it's something I've thought about a lot myself. Now, Gus brings up another great point about how some parents place their children in a strict religious school growing up with the purpose of building a solid foundation in their life. But this happens when the parents no longer adhere to the religion themselves. I just don't understand why people would do that, why they would force their kids down the same difficult path that they took, that they spent so many years breaking free of in their own life, as opposed to enrolling them in a martial arts class or a sport or a community organization to teach them discipline, self-respect, etc., and let them figure out their own spiritual path as they become an adult and truly have free will. It's just a thought. Now, I don't want to turn this into a Dennis Miller rant or something, so let's just get to the interview.
Cool. Hey, everyone. Thanks for tuning into the Fundamental Escape podcast. I'm pretty happy today to have a fellow Kiwi on the episode. So I've got Gus Row with me, who is, as I say, a local New Zealander. Do you want to just introduce yourself there, Gus, and explain a bit about your background and where you've come from and things?
Sure. Okay. Well, I'm in my 60s, so that puts me in the old category. And I grew up in the 50s and 60s in an evangelical setting, Brethren, Baptist, Charismatic, the whole deal. Spent 35 years working for Youth for Christ, including a stint as national director. Stepped out of that, but was part of a transition that where Youth for Christ in New Zealand became a dispersed missional kind of community, and I'm still part of that. But I also work in education locally, so I'm kind of people. The phrase is bivocational or trivocational. I have a few jobs, just working in education. So, and along the way, the transition out of Youth for Christ into this group called Incedo was part of a process of rethinking my faith, rethinking what I believe. And then Incedo asked me to do just look into some questions about our evangelical background. And the result of that was a series of books. So the first two have been published. First one's the Dehydrated Gospel, and the second one is Fast Food Religion. And I'm working on the next two at the moment. So, but that's very much a spare time thing. So surprised myself. I never thought I'd write a book, but
Yeah.
I did. Yeah. So there we go. Yeah.
Okay. No worries. I suppose to sort of set a foundation, what I'd be keen to hear from you would be, as you sort of touched on there, is the transition, like, I'm similar in the sense of growing up, in an evangelical church, from day one, basically. So I'd be keen to hear from you some of the key sort of moments or experiences that you had that led you to rethink or start asking questions about some of the traditional ideas that you were sort of handed.
Yeah, okay. Well, I can tell you a significant moment, but then I'll give you maybe some general feelings about it. A significant moment was I was in an ashram in India about in the early 2000s. And I was there just for 10 days in an ashram that serves the poor and rescues people on the street. And a young man or youngish man would wake me up every morning, me and my older brother, at 6 o'clock with a cup of hot chai and an amazing smile. He didn't speak English and we didn't speak Hindi, but it was just a great connection there. And I asked one of the leaders of the ashram to tell me his story, this young man's story. And it turns out that they'd rescued him. He was dying on the streets of Delhi. He was heroin addicted, and they nursed him back to health over a few days. And then when he was well enough to be carried into their morning worship, which I have to say resembles much more like a Hare Krishna service than a traditional Christian service, because they don't allow any English style worship, which I really appreciated. There's lots of bells and chanting, but it was fantastic. But anyway, he and all they know is that in the center of the ashram where they gather to worship is a picture of a stylized Indian, that subcontinent Indian Jesus. Now, the only reason you know he's Jesus if you've got a Christian background is he kind of looks like all the pictures you had in Sunday school of Jesus, only his features are Indian. So all this man knew was that was the guru that everybody was worshipping. And he began to join in the worship. Then the moment he was healthy enough, he started serving in that community, waking up early in the morning, serving chai to visitors like me, and then cleaning up AIDS, TB patients that had covered themselves in diarrhea during the night. And he would just do this continually. So with a smile, and go to bed and get up in the morning. So I was amazed by the man's heart, by his service. It was so Christ-like. So I commented on that, and so did my brother, who's an ex-AOG missionary pastor. And the leader of the ashram said, well, do you think he's converted? And we said, well, he's more converted than we are, and he's more converted than most Christians we know. And the ashram leader said, well, you realize that he's illiterate and he doesn't understand the idea of Jesus dying on the cross. If we could get him to teach him to read, and he read the Bible, he would probably reject the notion of Jesus being God and dying on the cross. And he's never prayed that we know any kind of prayer to accept Jesus into his life. And we sat there, and then he said, so is he converted? Well, you see, that's a major philosophical dilemma for me as an evangelical, because everything I've known growing up is that the key issue is some kind of personal assent to the notion of Jesus dying on the cross for my sins, and commitment to then being a Christian and following that Jesus. So here's a man who intellectually, to all intents and purposes, hasn't done that. And probably if he knew all the ins and outs, would reject it. But all he knows is that the group worship this man in the picture and that he's the guru. So he worships him too, in whatever way. So that's a dilemma at that point, because either I say, well, no, he's not converted, or I say he is converted, and if he is converted to the way of Christ, which I think he is, then he got in by a different door than I've been preaching all my life. Now, that makes Christians, evangelicals, nervous, because they say, oh, well, yeah, you're just saying it's just good works. And I go, well, yeah, it is. And that's exactly right. And Jesus said that's what we'd be judged on, which again makes evangelicals nervous, because they say, no, you're saved by grace alone. And I go, well, then if you believe that, you've got to ignore Jesus' sermon in Matthew, where he says you'll be judged on your work. So here we've got a guy who is my observation, and only God knows the heart, so I'm not making judgment, but I got to tell you, if God kicks this man out of heaven, then I don't deserve to get in, regardless of what I've done. Because here's a guy who has been set free from heroin addiction, so he's had this great good news of freedom, and has become a servant and who worships a picture that he doesn't understand, and in my opinion is thoroughly converted to the way of Christ. So the moment, now I got to say, and this again makes many of my evangelical friends nervous, I got to say, the moment you open the door to that and say it's possible, then you open the door to a much bigger gospel notion than the one I grew up with and the one I preached when I was in Youth for Christ and doing stuff in churches and evangelical churches. So that was as a moment in time that did unsettle me, and it meant that I could no longer, when you have your theological underpinnings and your faith philosophy challenged, you either retreat to a defensive position, which I see sadly a number of evangelical leaders doing, or you open a door into a bigger world, and that's a risky, well, I don't particularly think it is, but many people think that's a risky, dangerous world. I say go for it, because I can't see that you can retreat. Otherwise, you got to do what too many Christians do, which is shut your brain down when you walk in the door of the church or whatever. And I think if God gave me a brain to reason with, He gave me a heart to be passionate with, and those things which I believe are God-given have driven me to both examine my theological upbringing and reject a significant amount of it. So, yeah, that would be the moment. That would be a key moment for me.
Yeah, right. So you talk about, you sort of mentioned about what that did internally in shaking your foundations, I suppose. What were some of the, were you immediately, being I'm sort of that evangelistic kind of nature myself. I was a street preacher for about 5 years. So, did you have that impulse to immediately kind of vocalize these new ideas to people, or? The first thing for me was much more of an inner reflection. I've always been committed to reading and reflection, probably though when I was busy in YFC, I now am sorry that I didn't discipline myself to make more time for that. One of the problems of being in the business is that we get so busy doing this stuff that we don't allow time for really serious reflection, and so I probably I regret the fact that I didn't reflect more during my time in YFC. But certainly once around this time, I was starting to sacrifice the busyness of ministry for more time to reflect. And so there was a fair amount of inner reflection and dialogue with some close friends that I trusted. But the good thing was that as Youth for Christ made the transition to Incedo, there was much less emphasis on performance and on programs, and more on the being of faith. And that allowed more time. I didn't have to justify time spent reflecting on these kind of questions. And so I was able to discuss it with people and talk with people and engage with people about those kind of questions. So, yeah. Yeah, I guess one thing that comes to mind is, the author Brian McLaren talks about the concept of orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And, he basically says in the evangelical church, you can get an A+ in orthodoxy, but a complete failing grade in orthopraxy. You know what I mean?
Yep. Well, and he's right. The fact is, we don't really. Evangelicals say they believe in Jesus, but we don't. Not by if by believing in Jesus we mean a thorough engagement with the person of Jesus and who he was and what he said and what he asked of us and what he hinted at was the big story, the big mystery, the big picture of God. The problem with evangelicals, and I say this as one, I think, is that we're so sure that our doctrine is right that we make it the primary kind of activity of our lives, and we have this certainty about it, but we don't, and so we reject or we ignore things that challenge or that might challenge that doctrine, and we're very selective. So we read Scripture in particular ways that suit us, but we ignore Scripture that doesn't suit us. And the fact is, you can justify any kind of theology you want from the Bible. You know, I mean, Fred Phelps and the Westboro Baptist Church, that dreadful expression of religion that pickets funerals of returned soldiers in America and says they're going to hell, and gay people, and says the same thing. They tick all the doctrinal boxes. So, you know, if you were to do a doctrine test, they'd say, yes, they believe in Jesus, absolutely, and substitutionary atonement, you know, and the idea that we have to pray and believe. So, you know, so the doctrine's there, but the practice is, in my opinion, appalling, and nothing like what Jesus would want. So, you know, as I say, we're very happy with the parts of the Bible that support us. We explain away or ignore the parts of the Bible that get in the road or that make us too uncomfortable. And I'm guilty of exactly the same thing. So I'm just writing a blog now called "I Turned My Back on Jesus Last Week," which is, you know, absolutely true. That's what I did in India, twice in one day, and that's because if I'm serious about what Jesus said, then I turn my back on him, and I got to live with that. You know, the blog will explain a little bit more about that, but I just don't. I think as evangelicals we're too blasé about that stuff.
Yeah, I not to come across like a in-depth sort of journalist or anything, but I did actually Google your name to see what came up, and
that's terrible.
I found a transcript of a message that you actually preached back in 2007. And there's a couple of things I might come back to later, but there was something here where you said Jesus will be viewed not as someone who came to forgive our sins, but as someone intent on shaming us for our sins. Not as good news for the poor, but rather on the side of the well-off. Representing the status quo, not overturning it. Not as the man of peace, but as another angry religious leader. So, yeah, I thought that could be an interesting place to sort of transition into. You're right.
Oh, dearie me. See, I hate that. I have to say, Mark, that's the last time I ever preached. I made my life out of preaching, and, you know, I think I was reasonable at it. But I stopped preaching. That was the very final sermon I preached, and I haven't preached since. And I can't imagine a setting in which I would preach again. But that was at my own church, the church I went to and had been going to for over 25 years, at a commemoration, and they asked me to preach, and I was rather passionately preaching for a new way of seeing Jesus, and said that unless we were willing to engage with that,
what were some of the responses to that? Because some of the stuff you went on to say was pretty challenging.
Well, I mean, it's funny. I didn't think it was, you know. I mean, but then that's probably because of where I was. You know, I was down, and my wife keeps saying, "Mark," says, "Gus, you got to realise you're pushing ahead, and not everybody's, you know, where you're thinking." And I understand that. But at the time, I didn't think it was that shocking. But I mean, yeah, some of the reaction I got people coming up from to me saying that was great, you know, loved it. Which, you know, people have told me a number of times when I preached, but I'm not sure that it actually, you know, I don't mean to be horrible to those people. It's nice to get affirmation, but I don't know that it actually means anything, means much of anything, unless it, you know, because the whole thing the sermon was about change, and nobody really did anything about it.
Well, you went on to say, I guess it must have been towards the end, you said, until the pain of staying the way we are becomes greater than the fear of change, it won't happen.
Yeah, great line. I thought it was a brilliant line. I used illustration of the dentist. We won't go to the dentist. We get a toothache. We know the moment you get a toothache that there's something wrong. I mean, toothache is not normal. So you know that there's something wrong. But our fear of the dentist will prevent us from acting on it quickly until the pain of the tooth is so bad that it's greater than the fear of the dentist. And when that point reaches, and it's different for everybody, but when we get to that point, we go, I've got to go to the dentist. We make the booking and we put up with everything. Hopefully he gasses us or gives us an injection, and it's not too painful, but but it's the fear of it. So my point was, if we can say we want change, we don't like the church being defined as narrow and judgmental and all the things that it is currently defined as or perceived as. We don't like that. But we won't change until we realise that is actually damaging the cause of Christ. And so I just think people haven't reached that point. And it's not. I used to think my job was to try and provoke them to see the need. Now I'm not even interested in that. I'm so far out of the Christian scene that I certainly don't feel any great. Although, having said that, I've written these books, obviously, and the books are meant to be challenging, but I don't feel any personal calling now to change the church or to change Christianity. But I do think, people largely don't change. So some people said great, but didn't do anything. Some people objected quite strongly. And they were a range of ages, and they were for a range of reasons. Somebody told me that I was wrong, that everything was fine, and cited their own. They were a visitor and cited their own church somewhere, which they claimed was getting something like 20 or 30 conversions a week. And my point was, well, let's come back in 5 years and see where that's gone, because if you're correct, there'll be another church of 5,000 in your city, And of course that hasn't happened. But they're still claiming the 30 converts a week, which is part of the craziness of Christianity. We've done that all along.
Yeah.
Some people objected to the fact that I said that Jesus was down at the local mosque, and I realised that was provocative. But at the same time, I believe it strongly. I've been to our local mosque on a number of occasions, been to services there, and I think Jesus is there. But of course, everybody thinks, well, now you're saying that Islam is okay. And I just don't want to get into those arguments about which religion is right or wrong. I'm just not interested. But it just intrigued me that people, what really intrigues me about evangelicals is that we say we absolutely love Jesus and we love the world, but we seem intent on deciding who's not acceptable to Jesus. Defining who's missing the mark or who's not going to get in at the end. I just, like, people have said to me, you sound like a universalist, and the answer is absolutely. Why wouldn't I be? I want everybody. I don't want anybody to miss out. So, and I can't believe in a God who actually wants people to miss out. Now, I'm not saying that God's going to force everybody into heaven, but because I think free will is a dignity that God gives us. But the thing that bugs me about so many evangelicals is you get the feeling they actually don't want people there. That there's people they would prefer didn't make it in, and I go, where does that mindset come from? I used to believe, I think it's a horrible mindset that just because somebody's an atheist, I don't want them to get into heaven. Or just because they're a Muslim or a gay or whatever, that I don't want them to be in heaven enjoying God forever. I go, what on earth kind of toxic mindset is that? So, I'm raving now, Mark. See, you started now.
That's all right. I just wanted to, I suppose this kind of connects, to where I'm coming from a little way. The final sort of part of the sermon here basically says, personally, I don't think we believe the situation is that serious. I'm of the opinion we will talk about it, debate it, avoid offending anyone, stake our claim for what suits us, make some minor changes and carry on, business as usual. And then you say, please God, I hope I'm wrong.
Yep. What do you want me to say?
I mean, it's that last line, where I mean, I guess up until that point, where that last line, sort of takes away that notion that you're just being. Because I would be interested, as I say, to some people's sort of reactions. I'd be keen to talk more in depth about the points in your books. But, some of the reactions where people could sort of write you off and say, oh, you're just being cynical and you've just kind of been around too long and you're just over it. And, I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that idea.
Well, I mean, I do get that. I get people accusing me of being cynical and you kind of old and angry and I'm passionate, but I don't think I'm angry. I'm probably too old to be angry now. Too tired to be angry. But I don't buy the cynical thing because, here's what I find fascinating. Somebody can be angry and fundamentalist, and people will accept it. Somebody can speak words that I think are harsh and even cynical but from a fundamentalist perspective. And they almost get admired as a leader. So, I went and heard Mark Driscoll. I heard him, and there was 1,000 guys in the room cheering. This is over at his church. And he was saying what I considered some appallingly harsh, cynical things about what he considered liberal believers. And people were cheering. But if somebody says passionate things from a liberal perspective or a perspective perceived as liberal, they're rejecting Christianity or they're tired or whatever, So passion and fervency and even anger is acceptable if you're defending the status quo. But if you're questioning the status quo, somehow you are being nasty but I've spent my whole life within that evangelical thing. I've given most of my life to working on a faith-based basis in that kind of evangelical scene, and I'm still there. Clearly I don't belong the way I used to belong, because there's so many parts of it that make me uncomfortable, and I've got to be honest about those. But I haven't given up finding places to serve in the name of Christ. So, along the way, I've seen a hell of a lot of fervent, passionate fundamentalists ditch the thing entirely or go pear-shaped in their life and everything. And I'm not judging them for that because that's not my business, but I'm just intrigued that the moment somebody like me starts raising some questions and speaking with a fervency about a more liberal interpretation of the thing, that there's a tendency to write that off as cynicism or, to use labels like universalist, which is a terrible label to use. People say, Rob Bell writes a book in which he tries to explore, the concept of hell in the context of an awesome, loving God, and recognizing that this does present major dilemmas. And people use the label universalist, which immediately pegs him somewhere so that we can write him off. And that intrigues me. Whereas, another preacher, as I say, can be really nasty, but from a fundamentalist position, and he gets on it until he falls over badly, which, but yeah, I just don't get it. I think people should, the only question people should ask about Gus Row has nothing to do, with whether I tick all the correct doctrinal positions or that, but whether my life is somehow representing the Jesus I'm trying to serve. And if it doesn't, then tell me. If I'm failing to serve the colleagues at the school where I work and really care about them the way that Jesus would, then yeah, I ought to be challenged. But to me, it's always on the basis that of maybe some question I have about the way that particular theologies have shaped stuff, and shaped evangelical stuff, and from within. I'm questioning from within without jumping outside. I haven't declared myself an atheist. I have declared, well, I have stated that I no longer buy the label Christian, and I wouldn't identify myself as Christian. But that's because I think labels are silly. But I haven't denied my belief in God or my attempt to follow Jesus. But I don't understand why vigorous questions and explorations can't happen within that environment.
Yeah. I guess, would you say that in regards to the whole sort of labeling, like you sort of implied that it has more to do with the other person just wanting to put us in a category and write us off, sort of thing?
Yeah, well, I think so. I just think that the problem with labels is they're always divisive. Try Ford Holden. We used to have the V8s here in Hamilton, and people, you're either a Ford man or a Holden man. It seemed like you had to be, and you couldn't be both. And so I think we do that with faith, and we kind of like to peg somebody. So people ask what you are. And that's the reason now, like, people will ask me if I'm a Christian, and I'll say, no, I'm not. I used to say, I used to try and be clever and say, well, tell me what you think a Christian is. And inevitably, when they described what they thought a Christian was, it wasn't me. So I'd end up having to say no anyway. So now it's just easier for me to say, well, no, that's not a label I would choose for myself.
Yeah. It's funny, actually, you mentioned about asking other people to tell you what a Christian is, because I actually just recently had a friend of mine who told me that he does exactly the same thing, basically. That's quite interesting. But just to kind of get into the process or the thoughts and ideas leading up to the Dehydrated Gospel book, what would you say would be some of the key kind of moments where you're like, this needs to be a book, this needs to be an idea that people can access?
Well, what I was doing was, for the people in Incedo, the kind of leaders in Incedo, because I was part of it and am part of it, but I was initially part of the leadership, but stepped out of that. So now I just get to be the old guy hanging out in the organisation. And they asked my wife and myself to explore, they said, if you had some time, if you took some time to explore some of the questions, what could you look at? And we dialogued with them about that, and we came up with 3 questions to look at. The first one was, we know what the gospel looked like when we were used for Christ, but we don't believe that anymore, not that kind of gospel. But then what do we believe? What is the good news in our context now? The second one was, we know what discipleship looked like when we were Youth for Christ. Somebody came forward to Youth for Christ program. We made sure they had a Bible. We gave them a follow-up manual, which other organisations used to buy off us because they thought it was a pretty cool little booklet. And it was fill in the answers. You go through and the clue was Psalm 23, and you looked at it and you filled in the missing blanks. So it was a follow-up book. And then we encouraged them to go to quote Bible-believing church, which is hilarious to think about that concept now. And then, so that was the second question. Discipleship is such a misused term and misunderstood term, and it's problematic, as is a lot of our words now in Christianity. But what would this whole idea of being shaped by the person of Jesus look like, and what might, be significant in it? And then the third question, which we really haven't explored because it's become less important in some ways, is we know in the past we recruited people from evangelical churches and new converts to help make our programs happen, and YFC was very energetic about that. But we know that people now really don't want to sign up for evangelism, and we don't want to do evangelism as it was done in the past. But the bigger question for us was, in the past we used to recruit And we went through a hell of a lot of people. I mean, we burnt out a lot of people and went through them. We were a door in and door out. People came, did a few years in YFC. I mean, the country's full of people who did a few years for YFC. But we kind of wanted to ask, might inspire somebody to want to be part of a group of people who are trying to explore a bigger way or a newer way of being shaped by Jesus. So what we did was we visited a lot of people. Marg and I read a hang of a lot of books. We went away for retreats, a week at a time, and covered walls with newsprint and wrote up what we were felt we were hearing from God, and from our, just our reflection. And we started putting together little 2-page epistles, and we sent those out to about 40 people who'd expressed some interest in what we were doing. And it was just like 2 pages. Every time it was restricted to 2 pages so people could read it quickly and reflect on it and give us some feedback. Well, as that went along, different people said, this is good stuff, you ought to put into a book. Now, naively, I said, oh, what a great idea. I'll become the next Brian McLaren, or something, which is just hilarious that I even thought like that. But anyway, I had to go, and I spent most of a year putting it into the book, The Dehydrated Gospel, and getting that printed. And then the second book, Fast Food Religion, is the one that looks at the whole idea of being formed by the person of Christ. So that was the background to how the books came about.
Yeah. So I think I came across, was it one of the people you referenced in the Dehydrated Gospel, is it Frank Schaefer? Was he one of the guys?
I think I referenced Frankie Schaefer in the Dehydrated Gospel, yeah.
Yeah, because he's, I was really hoping I was getting that right. But he's someone I haven't read much of him, but I've seen some interviews and things, and he's actually in that documentary Hellbound, which he came across very, very well in that. And, he sort of said some similar things that you've kind of indicated, that idea of, don't look at the doctrinal sort of boxes that I'm ticking, but look at my life, look at how I treat my family, look at how I treat my neighbours, And
Yep.
I think that's something that we seem to have. I mean, it's sort of a fairly obvious question, I suppose, but would you say that that's one of the sort of reasons we don't want to ask questions about the gospel, we don't want to re-examine because of the potential cost that's involved?
Well, yeah, I think so. Frankie Schaefer is interesting in that he grew up in a thoroughly evangelical academic kind of environment as you can get. And as in the second book, Fast Food Religion, I acknowledged that his father, Francis Schaefer, was one of a number of people who had a major impact because he wrote such brilliant books that were, apologetics for the Christian faith and for the evangelical Christian faith. But of course, what Frankie said has exposed is that while that may be true, and he honours his father for that not everything was right in terms of practice. That there were some issues, and I admire him for saying that. Because it must be hard. And yet we don't want to accept that that's the case, that a tremendous amount of evangelical leadership has been in trouble and is in trouble. The second book, my second book on discipleship, I preface it by saying that if you do the research now on evangelical church life and on the state of leadership, it's potentially a bit of a horror story, or it's certainly at odds with what we say we believe. So, we don't research this in New Zealand much, but they do in the States and in England. And there's a number of organisations focus on the family, the Schaefer Institute, the Barna Institute, Fuller Institute, in the States, who thoroughly research church life. And when they research evangelical pastors, they discover that, probably over half of them would leave the ministry tomorrow if they could find a different job. So you got half of your preachers and pastoral leadership who actually want to get out, but they don't admit that from the pulpit. So my great, I guess my great conviction and charge against the evangelical church is that there's an incredible dishonesty there. Over 70% of these pastors, when surveyed, say they never read the Bible unless it's to prepare a sermon. Well, I'm not standing up saying I'm a great Bible reader. So, I don't want to set myself up here. I just wish we'd be honest, So all these pastors are getting up in church and giving the impression, one, that they've got some kind of spiritual life that's reasonably together, and two, that they're hearing from God. And neither of those are that true. I just wish we could be a whole lot more honest about it and say, there's some issues here. We're not getting this thing right, yeah.
I mean, on that sort of subject of honesty, just going to bring up a pretty strange example, but we, back in the day, like we used to have youth church kind of services, once a month kind of thing, and we had this woman come and speak at one of our events, and she basically got up, and I can't remember how old I would have been, but she told this really obscure story about this experience that she had on holiday, and I can't remember all the details, but basically she was talking about wanting to be sort of real and honest with God and just authentic, and in this service she basically, you could hear a pin drop, but she's just said these two words, and she says, "No bullshit." And it was this moment where some people actually got offended. They couldn't understand what she was saying, where she was coming from. But for me, I just had this, there was holy ground kind of thing, where it was this person just being totally real and authentic and honest. And I just sort of wonder, why do we have this culture where, we kind of go to church on a Sunday and it's like, hey, how are you? I'm fine. I'm good. Great. How's everything going? Good. Why do we keep up this sort of charade? Why do we keep doing it?
Well, I'm probably the wrong person to ask because I stopped going 8 years ago. So, I don't know why we keep it going. I know I did it for many years, and I don't know. And I'm not saying that I think church services should be where everybody comes and hears their dirty linen. I just think when you go to church, you should accept that we've all got it. Not everybody has to know all of my issues, but they need to know that I've got significant enough issues that I'm in trouble and stuff. But I think part of the reason is let me try and explain this. I don't know whether it's led from the front or led from the congregation, because if a pastor is really honest, it may be that the congregation no longer want to listen to him or no longer want to follow. So there may be that maybe the congregation is demanding this kind of success madness that we sometimes get, or maybe it's because the leadership have created the idea that in order to be leaders, they have to be better than, or to be successful, and the rest of the congregation just go along and want to believe that that's the case. We want to believe that somebody's worked it out and found the secret and made it happen, and that it's all fine. So I don't know which one of those is the major cause of it, and consequently, I don't know the way out of it. Except I kind of long for some pastors to take the lead and start breaking down the facade. I would love to hear pastors begin to share their own stories of pain and dysfunction as people of faith, because now that might cost them their jobs, but I think it would be a good thing. I was talking to a woman just recently, and she's about 20 years younger than I am, I think, got a young family, and she was saying that she and her husband they go to a really lively church, but they're just over it, And I said, well, why do you keep going? And she said, well, for the kids, really. And so I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, it's important for them to learn the stuff, And I said, so let me get this right. You spent 40 years of your life in it, and now it's driving you crazy, and it's not helping your faith at all. And you want to consign your kids to that. You kind of hoping that they're going to do exactly the same thing. They're going to grow up just like you did, and for a while they'll be excited about it, and by the time they're 40, they'll be over it. What kind of madness is this? At what point can you not stand up? I'm not saying stand up and announce it in church, but can you not declare that this is not helping your faith?
Yeah.
And so there is just this. I don't know. I wish there were a lot more brave pastors and leaders who would kind of be honest about this stuff.
Do you ever get pastors and leaders like sort of coming to you in private and telling you about their dysfunctions and things, or?
Well, they don't tell me too much, but no, I'll tell you what happens. I meet. It's interesting that there's a small round table of pastors that meets every couple of months to talk about issues and current issues. And I'm still part of that group, largely I think because it was started by a pastor who's a friend of mine. But there's no question that I'm definitely, however you want to describe it, I'm on the fringe of the space theologically and stuff. And they're all, pretty much everybody there is in pastoral leadership and committed to church and making it happen, whereas I don't even go. So, there's no question there's quite a difference between us. But they're good people and I enjoy their company. But I don't know, I don't know that it really gets that honest. It's more talking about issues. So, when a book like Love Wins comes along, they all want to talk about it because people in their congregation are reading it and they don't know what to do and stuff like that.
I bet they
so
caught some
the other
chaos.
thing I'll tell you what does happen. In cafes, there would not be a week go by that I do not meet somebody in a cafe who's been in significant leadership in evangelical Christianity, but who is either frustrated to heck, who feels trapped or has left the institution or has left the faith entirely and would declare themselves atheists. And I admire the honesty of that. But I meet these people all the time, but I think that's because that's where I live my life now, So, and of course, word gets around a little bit, So I'll talk to somebody and they'll say, "Oh, well, you ought to talk with so and so," and I don't seek people out. I can say that genuinely. I'm not looking for disaffected Christians because I'm not trying to start anything, but I do. I just meet them and I meet people all the time. People are talking now about. There's been recent talk about the rise of the nuns. That's NES, the people who profess no religious affiliation in census, and that's on the increase in New Zealand as it is in most Western countries. But of course, probably the biggest growth is in people who called the Dones, DONES, which means they're done with it. And these are people who have been part of evangelical Christianity most of their lives. A significant number of them have filled leadership roles, and now they're done with it. And the problem is, when I talk with existing church leaders about it, there's almost an automatic assumption that these people are rebellious or apathetic because they don't actually want to follow Jesus. And both of those are quite wrong. I've never met one person yet who is done with it, who has been anything other than through a painful, grieving disconnect from stuff that they grew up with, and who actually longs for a place where they can live out their faith with some reality. They're also accused of being self-centered. They just want a church that suits them. And again, most of these people are like myself. In my lifetime, I only belonged to 5 churches, and every one of those was when I shifted location. I never shifted. My wife and I never shifted from one church to another, just when we were in the same city. So, you know, and most of the people I talk to have been like that. They've stuck in church. They've tried leadership. They've tried to play a role. They've done all this stuff, and then they've just reached a point where they say, "This is damaging me more than it's helping," and so they are they've either left or in the process of trying to leave, or sadly some of them are still in there and just paying the price of their own soul. And the thing that I do find is exactly what happened with my wife and I, that those who leave never end up having the privilege of an honest conversation about why. It's almost like leadership doesn't want to know, because it'll be too hard to hear, too painful. I find that sad. You know, I just think it's not helping.
Yeah. I think it was in a conversation that Brian McLaren actually had with Frank Schaefer, where he was saying how so many people are, they're clinging to their religion, and their religion is punching them in the stomach, basically.
That's a brilliant idea. I haven't heard that, but that's exactly what a lot of them feel.
Yeah. So, do you think that, you know, with, like you talked about the nuns and the duns, do you think that the church will ever reach a breaking point? Like, do you think it will come to a head where things have to be confronted?
Mark, this is probably hard to say. Well, it's hard to say, and it might be hard to hear. I don't know. I used to be an optimist, that there would be a groundswell of people. I'm no longer sure about that. I suspect that things will just carry on. People will continue to leave, and things will dwindle. And I'm just not sure that there's, I would challenge anybody now in New Zealand to try and start an evangelical, and I know that word has horror feelings for many people now, because of their past, but to start some kind of evangelical event or movement, and get the people willing to give the money, the resource, the time, the effort to make it happen, even if it was based on a much newer understanding of a bigger gospel. I just don't think people want to do it. I just think people are tired of it, but they will continue to keep going to church. And most of the people I know who used to be involved in evangelism, a significant number of them still go to church, but they just go. Any idea of some kind of re-energizing movement for the church, or for Christianity, I don't think there's. I would challenge anybody to try it. I mean, I know people have tried to, have another big outreach, and bring a named speaker over from the States, and I understand why people wouldn't want that. I wouldn't want that. People have tried to resurrect Youth for Christ in New Zealand, and but nobody wants to do it. And so anybody who's holding on to the idea that there's going to be some new outreach movement that's going to revive Christianity in New Zealand, I think is bound for disappointment. Certainly in my lifetime, which won't be that much longer.
Yeah.
Short of God bringing some kind of fresh thing happening, I don't think it's going to happen on any scale. Because the fact is, and this is the point of one major thesis of the Dehydrated Gospel, the evangelism of the last 60 years hasn't worked. So we just ought to admit that. In the last 60 years, if you counted up every crusade, and there's a crazy name to have for an outreach event, and currently a terribly insensitive name that some people still seem to want to use, but if you counted up every crusade, every Youth for Christ activity, open air campaigners, YWAM, churches, decades of evangelism, and all of these kind of things. We probably claimed a third of the New Zealand's population as Christians, and yet the church has declined. So it hasn't worked. Now, people will get offended by that and say, oh, yes, it has. Our church has got, we got 10 new converts last year, whatever. And some people will say, and I get this from my friends, but it worked for you, Gus. You came to Christ, at a Youth for Christ program, or, at a Easter camp, stuff like that. But you just got to do the math. It hasn't worked as we believed it would work, because back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, evangelicals believed that if you could get enough people saved, our world or New Zealand would change. Well, here's the news. We got a lot of people saved, so-called saved, but it hasn't worked the way that we expected it to work, and people are leaving. So there's probably no shortage of 13-year-olds, maybe a little bit less, willing to put their hands up at an Easter camp, but everybody, they're all disappearing out the other end. Whether it's at age 20 or 30, or in my case, age 60, people are giving it up. So, to me, that's the first point we ought to say, is that what we've done over the last 60 years has not achieved what we believed it would achieve. Now, if you start with that, you've got to ask the question, so what's coming down the highway that is going to make anything any different? And I don't see anything. There's all sorts of, if you look at, the charismatic movement in the 60s, which I was part of, if you look at the signs and wonders thing that came through in the 80s, if you look at all these moves, so-called moves of God that happen, and then the emergent thing in the early 2000s and stuff, none of it has resulted in any significant change or growth, and growth, by growth I don't just mean numerical, but emotional, and the church, I would argue now, is less robust, less able to grapple with big questions than it was 60 years ago. So something hasn't worked, and it's hard to see anything that's likely to bring that about.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't want to get all defensive on the whole emergent trip, but I suppose it comes down to the questions that we're asking. Because the questions that we ask, obviously, are an indicator of the values that we hold. Like you say, if we're asking how many numbers have come in, like what's, if that's our sort of measuring stick, then obviously we're going to go, we're going to have a certain viewpoint sort of thing. So, but if you start looking at it, I mean, I would argue in regard to, I mean, for myself, as I say, I did, evangelism for a number of years and completely burned out. And I was at a point where, I didn't feel that I, was able to continue holding my faith at all, because my whole worldview was completely, shattered. And I was like, and so obviously, I came into, sort of reading different books by Brian McLaren and different authors and things, and understanding their journey and where they came from. And, of course, you're not going to find, there's no magic pill. I think we could both agree on that. So we're not going to come across a book that's going to change the whole game. And, obviously Love Wins in 2011 was, that was a fairly big game changer in the evangelical scene, in the sense of, it cracked open the ability to actually ask some questions. The whole topic of hell, up until that point, at least from my perspective, was something that you just never questioned, and that book at least gave people a voice to say, hey, hang on a minute, we're allowed to examine this. So there must be some sense of, optimism when you look at the trajectory of where things are going. There's, I would argue, I guess you could disagree, but I would argue that there is, some progress, though it may be slight.
Yeah, well, we probably have to disagree on that one. I mean, yeah.
Hey, I was trying to give you a chance not to come across as cynical.
Well, no, but you see, then you're assuming that just because I'm a pessimist that I'm, and I know you don't intend this, Mark, but the assumption is because I lack optimism about the state of the church, and of Christianity that I'm, that something, pessimism somehow links with cynicism or whatever. And I mean, I am pessimistic. But only if you're talking about how the idea of the church growing and becoming something significantly different. I'm not optimistic about that. So I am a pessimist. Yeah. What I am optimistic about a small number of people in different places getting serious about trying to work out what Jesus was really about, and realizing they never will answer it, but that the fun will be in trying to explore that. But that's a whole lot different than thinking something is coming up that is going to revolutionize or re-energize the church or Christianity. And so on that level, that's why I say I'm not at all convinced. I'm pessimistic about that.
Well, if you frame it like that, if you frame it that way, I agree with you. I don't think my hope is not in something that's coming up in the future. I mean, Jesus says, those people will look this way and that way for the kingdom, but they won't find it because it's within you. Like, I think like you've sort of talked about it, that practical, experiential, like watching how people live and how they interact and how they treat one another. I think that's what it, that's ultimately to me what it needs to come down to, really.
Yeah, I think that the problem for evangelicals is that we want to kind of, well, we do believe that people need to make some kind of step, but once you take away hell and kind of the whole substitutionary atonement thing as the principal experience or expression of that, take away the heaven and hell thing, you don't actually have much left to build it on. What are you going to say that people, like, how do people sign up?
How do we record the numbers?
Well, yeah, but I mean, in the end, that's what you're asking, because I could say, well, look, I don't care about the numbers, and I'm happy then if the church disappears, because in the end, the hell business is it's for God to deal with. I don't have to worry about it, and so which is the key thing about hell was it gave evangelicals both a motive and a measurement. You could say, well, if our motive is we want to save people from going there, and our measurement is when people pray to accept Jesus, they've joined the ones who are avoiding hell and who are going to heaven. Well, that's a very definable, kind of measurement. It's also a very energizing motivation for people, and it kind of galvanizes people to do something. Now, take that away, and so the next question is, well, what? And we say, well, then everything's a whole lot more open, which is what I certainly believe myself. But at the same time, I accept that I'm not saying the idea of hell was a good motivator, because I don't think it was, but it was a motivator. And so now that you don't have that, the question is, what is going to prompt somebody to both live as a reflection of the person of Jesus and want other people to do that? And how are you going to go about defining that or making that happen? So I'm avoiding the word kingdom, because I do think, while I understand what Christians mean by kingdom, I think it's an unhelpful concept in a country like we have, where we don't like kings anyway. I think it conjures up all sorts of imagery that's unhelpful. But if you wanted to, I guess I'm asking, what would it look like if you had a group of people who genuinely wanted to follow Jesus? How would you define that? And what would it look like for other people to be invited to join that if you don't have that saved from hell to heaven kind of expression. And I think that's a major issue, because all of the people I see in things like the emergent movement and that, I don't think they've worked that out. I think they in effect, it's kind of like, it's a very open thing now, about what a Christian might look like or be like, and it's, on that basis, it's very hard, when you have it that open, it's very hard to define and very hard to recruit, and yeah.
Yeah, but I guess even that sort of language, though, like defining and recruiting, like, is that even the point? Is that even what it's meant to be about at the end of the day?
No, I don't think it is, but that's why I don't think you can. That's why I don't think there's any kind of, once it's all open, the whole business of any kind of movement or any kind of collective or that is really becomes almost irrelevant. So I'm not trying to recruit people to Christianity, and I'm not trying to recruit people to any organisation or any kind of movement at all. But I think when we ask, when you say then, is there any hope, or am I optimistic? The question is, optimistic about what? That more people will behave like Jesus. That would be my hope. How optimistic am I? Not sure. Not a lot, So I think we just have to own the fact that this is now a very vague situation to be in, and that a lot of the people who are writing about it, and I think even people like, if I'm allowed to, I'll be accused of heresy even by my own friends, if I say even people like Brian McLaren. They're writing a lot of stuff that is making the whole deal way more open, and way bigger. But that's not. But they're not really talking about. It's not like Brian or Rob Bell or anywhere is getting a collective of people who are demonstrating what a shared commitment to following Jesus might look like, that somebody else could learn from. I don't see it. I see people who are living that out, but I don't see any kind of new church arising or new expression of Christianity arising that is so attractive to people in their expression of Jesus that people want to be part of. So I think there's a lot of stuff being written about it, but I guess I'd challenge you to find those new expressions that are drawing people into something that is identifiable, and people need that in the end. They need to see something that they go, that's kind of, I want to be part of that journey, and that it has something that identifies it. Otherwise, it could, basically you could just have a meeting of people together, and that they could all pray to their own God and share a meal, and that'd be good, And I'm not against that either, but it's not what I would define as a Jesus movement.
Yeah.
I think,
in a sense, I would argue that's pretty much what happens really anyway, if you break it down. You can have 100 people sitting in a church building who have 100 different perceptions of God anyway.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, you could, yeah.
So,
hey, I'm not arguing for a return or for the status quo or for a return to the way things used to be. You definitely.
I'm sort of. I don't. I'm interested, I guess, in what you are arguing for, in a sense, because it's one thing to deconstruct something that you don't agree with, but then what are you left with?
Yeah. Well, you have to deconstruct, Mark. There's no question about that. That's the first step, and that's often a long and painful step. In my case, it was, I wouldn't call it deconstructing, as detoxing. So I wasn't taking things apart. I was just trying to identify things about my faith upbringing that were toxic, both to my own soul and to my relationships with other people. So I wasn't trying to destroy or demolish, but I was detox. For me is a more appropriate word. So that's been a long journey. What am I? No, what am I trying to build? In a lot of ways, for me, that Jesus is always going to be crucial. Jesus is the central, because, and this will upset my atheist friends that I'm so stuck on this, but they know already. There's something about the person of Jesus I can't get past. I don't buy a lot of the theology that I was told about Jesus, but there's something about the person of Jesus. I also recognise that had I grown up in the back of Afghanistan, I'd probably be a passionate Muslim. So it's a fluke of birth that I happened to be in a Christian environment where I learned about Jesus. And the more I connect with the person of Jesus, there's something about him that inspires me in the way that I see him as an example, the greatest example of living humanity. And so I'm stuck on trying and failing often to shape my life around the person of Jesus. So in terms of any kind of collective, I guess I'm keen on people who want to explore what that looks like, because I do believe it's best worked out in a collective fashion. I think the Lone Ranger thing is dangerous, because then Gus Row, left to his own brain, is in trouble. Having people around who can both support and challenge and help me explore what it means is really helpful and essential. So that's what I'm kind of trying to, in terms of, if there's anything I want to build, it's I want to be with people who will allow the person of Jesus to shape the way they live their lives collectively. But that's all. I'm not trying to start a movement or sign people up to belong to an organisation or anything.
It's curious to me though. Like you say that, but then at the same time, you're writing books about what you're thinking. Like, you must be there's something you're doing or attempting to do.
Well, I'm writing books because people ask me to write the books. That's all. And look, to be honest, Mark, they're not selling. So I'm writing them, but partly because I guess it helps me and it helps a small group of people around me. But I'm not. I mean, nobody's really buying them. So it's not. And this is why I say to my minister friends when they get concerned about something I say, you don't have to worry about it because nobody's listening. So it's not like a big deal. So I think if I was on Oprah's new network selling my ideas, they'd probably be a little more, they ought to be more concerned, but I'm not, and that's never going to happen, sadly. So I think you're right. I'm writing books, but that's in response to a request from some people who and because I do bump into people who find themselves on a similar journey, and it's easier to put some of those thoughts down in a cheap book and allow them to reflect on that and ponder than for me to try and meet with, like I can sell 200 books and 200 people get to read and reflect on it. If I tried to meet with those 200 people, that would be really difficult. And so, in as much as some people find it helpful and to reflect on, I'm kind of willing to do that. But I'm not writing the books to start a movement or to really,
Would you say, I think what comes across to me in what I have sort of picked up, as much as what you're saying and writing about is, very challenging to a huge number of people. I do sense like a genuine level of empathy, like of like this kind of connecting with people who maybe, be hurt by church expressions or, or their background and things like that. Like, would you say that's part of it, or?
Yeah, I mean, once I got out of the madness of programming, and that took way too long. But once I got out of that, I would say that I'm genuinely, I'm able to spend more time with people, hearing what they're going through, and where it's possible, connecting the dots between their experience and my own. And I think part of what, and I got to be careful here, but because of my history and my position in ministry over the years, some people find it encouraging to hear that somebody who has been in that role is asking the same questions and has the same doubts, and but hasn't chucked the whole thing away. So it gives me the opportunity to sit and listen to what people have been through, and also to, and I'm very cautious about this, but to say from my position as someone who has been seen as a leader in the past, I'm very nervous about identifying as any kind of leader, but somebody who's been seen as a leader, for me to say to them, hey, it's okay for you to label that as wrong or abusive, and it's okay for you to take the time to find a way forward. And if right now you don't find you can believe a lot of that stuff, that's okay too. So I met a young woman who came from a fairly, I would say, dysfunctional family situation, who ended up in a charismatic church, and experienced what I would consider Pentecostal abuse, people trying to pray demons out of her and stuff like that, in a way that was, abusive and bullying, and so I was able to say, look, to, in a sense, apologise. So look, as somebody who was part of leadership in those kind of mad Pentecostal days, or demon deliverance days, I apologise that you were treated like that, and it's okay for you to be angry, and it's okay for that anger to have pushed. It's not okay that it did push you away, but it's okay for you to feel you need to distance yourself from that form of Christianity, and explore your own faith journey. Now, again, some of my evangelical friends would be unhappy about that, because they think that the likelihood is she will move further away from Christianity, and maybe that'll happen, I don't know. But I find that people need to hear that the questions and doubts they have, and the objections they have to the abusive expressions of Christianity that they've experienced, that it's important for them to hear that abuse wasn't okay, but that their response to it is understandable, and that God isn't hitting them over the head for wanting to walk away. That God isn't, that He's not like that. So yeah, I would say I'm in a position now where I have a lot more time to sit and listen, and to identify and to kind of encourage people. But it's not a case of trying to sign them back up to Christianity, or sign them back up to the way that, or to get them back to church or anything like that.
Yeah, awesome.